before we actually go into your story, I actually want to start with a bigger picture question. Can you talk about your relationship with risk and what you learned about risk from your parents?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because my parents being immigrants, risk is kind of inherently in their blood, right? They left their home country where, their ancestors are, where their parents are, their siblings, their cousins, and both of them were the first to leave.
Oh, really?
So, like in their families, and then they brought their siblings to the US. So, it's funny because it's kind of in their blood and in their nature. However, when you do that, when you move to the US, I think your risk tolerance completely flips because you took such a big risk. So growing up, and I speak for kind of like South Asian people, I think a lot of them can relate, but the jobs that you're supposed to have are the de-risked jobs, like lawyer, doctor, engineer. You are supposed to go to college, like you are essentially de-risking your whole life as a first generation American, but it's so at odds with what our parents actually did that I just think it's so fun. It's funny, right? Because it's a dichotomy. And my dad, he was an entrepreneur, not by choice. I always say I'm an entrepreneur by choice. He was an entrepreneur because he had a limited education, and in the US, that's what he kind of was forced to do. But I think they just thought a better life for us is a de-risked life. So it's just funny when I talk to my I don't tell her too much because I think she would die if I told her too much and she would be too worried. But the high risk life that I'm living now with my career, I actually think they wouldn't want that for us because they already did that. They're like, we did that so you wouldn't have to do that. So it's kind of an interesting, like, touchy subject, I think, both culturally and like when your kid is, I mean, I can see it when your kid is doing something that's risky, like it's like anxiety for you too. So it's a touchy subject, I would say, with them.
Yeah, no, I so resonate with that. My dad also was like an entrepreneur, came here from, his country and was like, I don't want you doing this. Stay in corporate, make money. Like his thing was always make a lot of money, probably to the point where, which I definitely want to talk to you about this. Like I went down the banking route and stayed there just for money for so long until I'm like, I am so unhappy. Like he doesn't equal happiness. But again, our parents just want that stability for us, want us to be financially secure because they killed themselves to create that life. So I also think it's interesting. I believe from a young age, you also mentioned like you were kind of obsessed with money too. Like you were bustling and bustling. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, I was. And I think part of it is because I didn't have it. Growing up, I mean, we grew up super, super modestly, in a very small town in Texas and didn't have much. Like I started working at a super young age. My sisters worked. I worked throughout college. I got a scholarship to college, like, or else it would have been, loans and loans. But that's all to say, I think the reason I was and it's still funny. I talked to my therapist about having like this weird relationship with finances and a weird relationship with money that I'm working on. I always thought money would like set me free, right? Like it was the thing that, if I just had control over that, I could do whatever I wanted. I could buy whatever I wanted. I could, live a life in the way that I wanted. Whereas it was so restricted for my family and for my parents. So, and it's something that I don't know, like brown people don't really talk about, like South Asian people, like don't really talk about, it's like a touchy subject. Again, like you don't,
Especially as women, it's like you don't talk about these things.
yeah. And like you don't talk about how much you have or don't have, and you don't ask for more. And it's just, it's a little weird. And so I thought it would give me independence and kind of set me free. And I think that's why I was so obsessed with it. And now it's funny because the satisfaction that I get from the business is so not that. Like I still have kind of an interesting relationship with it when it comes to like fundraising or, whatever it is. But it's all the satisfaction that I get from the business is from the team or from, solving a really hard problem or running a really cool consumer campaign. Like it's all these intangibles that have nothing to do with financial success. So I would say it's kind of like flipped its head a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you don't know that until you're in it and you're like, all right, I'll be quote unquote happy once the business hits this number.
Yeah.
And then you realize,
And
oh, I hit that. I know. You're like, wait, I hit that number and I actually have like more money, more problems. There's more business issues, people. And I'm actually curious if you feel comfortable kind of talking about it. You mentioned your relationship with money is something you're working on with your therapist. I feel like in terms of just unpacking my own relationship, like similar to you, I always thought that money equals happiness. I actually didn't realize how much of my identity was tied to my successful job and finances until I left, no income anymore, starting my own business, where I was like, wow, I didn't realize how that was so much of my identity. I felt like completely naked when I started my business 3 years ago. So if you don't mind sharing, like, what are some of the things that you're feeling and working through when it comes to money? Because I think it would probably help so many people listening today.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing is kind of piggybacking off what you mentioned around the number won't bring you happiness. Especially now I have a few investors and advisors who are, on paper successful. They sold their businesses, made a ton of money, and usually at a young age, right? Like in their I would say like late 20s, 30s. And what they say after having like many conversations with them is that after that happens, nothing actually changes. You don't actually all of a sudden wake up and you're like, this is amazing. I feel great. I'm super happy. So being tied to, I'll be happy when the business is doing $1 million a year, or, I'll be happy when I can pay myself $200,000 a year. Like, being tied to that is futile, because to your point, you reach it and then you're like, shit, I actually don't feel any different, and maybe feel worse because I just realized that like it doesn't. So like, what actually brings me happiness? And they always say like it was actually the grind and like doing the work and the team and the day to day, and like that is actually what brought them joy, and they thought it would be the exit, and the multi-million dollars in their bank account. So yeah, I think that's been kind of like the biggest learning and thing that I've been working through with it is, and I think that also stems from being really achievement oriented. So growing up, it's interesting. I did a values exercise when I was at McKinsey, and there was 50 values that we had to prioritize, and then we ended up with our top 5 and our bottom 5. And in my top 5, my number one value, this is over like family and loyalty and like very strong values. My number one value was achievement. I cared that much about being valedictorian, or, getting the full ride, or, making it to McKinsey and having that on my resume. Like, those achievements I cared. And now obviously like it's a financial game, but those achievements I cared so much about that I would like run myself ragged. Like,
Yeah.
I would do things and I would make life decisions just based on, getting to that goal, because I was so obsessed with it. And that's kind of what financials, it's a number, right? Like, you can get to that achievement level. So I realized kind of the relationship between the two. And it is crazy as you get older. Like, you realize that like it really doesn't, the number doesn't matter, the finances doesn't matter. Like, it's everything else that really does.
It's so true. And it's funny because similar to you, I kind of like pushed myself to burn out, got all those like quote unquote amazing jobs. And when I started my own business, I actually found myself in a very similar state of pushing too much, feeling burnt out. And I'm like, Yasmin, you left everything to not feel like that again. Starting a business, you have waves of intensity. But have you ever felt yourself in that burnout and achievement state where you're like, dang, Sabeena, like you left everything and you're kind of back at that stage here?
Yeah, so it's funny because I've never really had balance. Like, I know people talk about work-life balance, and I think, like hustle culture was canceled and everybody's like, everyone needs to lower their cortisol and needs to like calm down. And I do believe that, especially for myself, because I've lived in fight or flight for so many years. But I have always worked really hard, and I noticed it in my 20s that like it started to become a really like important part of my life, and it wasn't as much with friends, even my sister's family. We were raised by the same parents, right? Like, and so it
Interesting.
is kind of interesting to see the variances. Like, career will always be a big part of my life because I like it. I genuinely enjoy it. So when I started Dough, I didn't mind sleeping 6 hours and the other 18 hours being awake working. Like, I really didn't mind that because I was so passionate about it. I was excited. There were so many fun things happening. I didn't realize I was burning myself out. Like, one
Yeah.
one big teller of it, it happens physically to me before it happens mentally. I remember I have this photo of my skin when I call it like 6 months after, and I was filming Shark Tank 6 months after we launched. Maybe it was like 8 months after we launched. And my skin had never, it was so broken out with acne. Like, it was so bad. I was like, I'm about to go on national television. I can't, like, makeup's not going to cover this. Like, it was so, and I have that photo and I have it in my favorites just to like remember what it was like. So at the time, I didn't know there was anything wrong with it. I was excited, whatever. And then I think I would say like beginning of last year, beginning of 2023 is when I hit, a burnout that I was like, oh, this is not sustainable,
Yeah.
to I'm not being my best self. I'm not being the best leader. I'm not being the best wife. I'm not being, the best friend, and something has to change. And that's when I did the overhaul. But, the McKinsey training and the even big CPG, you work a lot, like all of those places, venture where I worked last, you're rewarded for working super hard and quote unquote burning yourself out. So I kind of just carried that into entrepreneurship.
Yeah, totally. And it helps, but it's like the sustainability factor when you're going to be doing this year over year is very different than working at a job, right? And like going to 0 to 100, which yes, it's a rude awakening, but something we all kind of realize. So before, going into your story with your business, I actually love you mentioned that in your journey, you learn the rules before breaking them, which I think there's so much to unpack there. Tell me more what you mean by that.
I feel like we've gotten into this world where, and maybe it's calmed down a little bit because the market
Sure.
has changed quite a bit for especially the fundraising environment, but where, a 24-year-old entrepreneur is God, it's like they're really rewarded for being the youngest that did X, or, you'll see a headline that's like 25-year-old is the youngest to raise $20 million for blah, blah, blah. Like that's the kind of clickbait that we see. And Forbes 30 under 30 doesn't help, right? Like that's a huge, for someone who's obsessed with achievement and did not achieve that, that is a big marker for people like, oh, I need to do something, that's worth Forbes 30 under 30 before I'm 30. Otherwise I'm nothing, right? Like otherwise my career doesn't matter. And that has been rewarded for so much. So like I would say for the last 10 years, millennials kind of made it a thing. I feel like we're kind of guilty of it. Whereas I actually am so glad I had my work experiences and my life experiences before Doe. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to do what I do every day or, achieve what I've achieved in a short amount of time because those experiences were so necessary. But, where we often reward the like dropped out of college and, launched this business. And it's like, wait, well, yeah, that's great. But like, it's also most successful businesses. I don't remember what the average age is of the entrepreneur, but I'm pretty sure it's like 40
It's
or something like
45 or
that.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, like in the 40s. And so it's kind of interesting because if you look at the stats, you're actually better off getting experience and failing a little bit and working a little bit. But we glamorize, I think, the young entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, having experience is such, I think, also a competitive advantage as well. But so you mentioned, you worked at CPG brands like Pepsi, Frito-Lay, and it's so interesting. Actually, I was listening to another interview, and you said that during that time, you actually had a blog where you were talking about like healthy things. Like, tell me more about that dichotomy because working at Pepsi and then having a health blog, like, is very different amongst
This
the
is very
two.
weird. Yeah. Well, no, but what's kind of funny is the people that worked. I can speak for Frito-Lay specifically. I don't know about other CPG companies, but my team, even specifically on Lay's, was really healthy. So like we were eating salads for lunch and we would do team juice cleanses back when juice cleanses were a thing, or we would sign up for a Soul Cycle and the five of us would go to Soul Cycle together, right after work. And so my team was really healthy. And so it was just odd. It's actually more bizarre that we were all selling, Lay's potato chips and Doritos and Cheetos because we were like not living that way. So the blog in that context, I mean, it was with my best friend Carrie, and we were talking about, and we're both from Texas, so we were talking about like little hacks to become healthier or swaps you can make, basically trying to get consumers or our readers to a point where they would actually make the decision versus trying to say another way we could have done it is you need to eat a salad every single day for lunch and have kale juice. And I'm pretty sure my siblings, whoever else was reading it, would be like, no, F off, like we're not doing that, like it's too big of a leap. So it was focused on getting like meeting people where they are. But it was an interesting dichotomy because here I am selling junk food, and at the same time in my personal life and with my team, I'm trying to eat a little bit healthier and kind of preach that. So there's a guilty conscience, I think, that you get when you're doing that.
Totally, totally. Well, I know afterwards you worked at a venture studio, which I'm sure you got so much experience in the startup world and everything. So tell me more about why you made the leap, I guess, from working with startups, and I know you were consulting as well, to then wanting to start a company. Did you know that was something you wanted? And was cookie dough always that number one thing that you wanted to do? Or how did that come about?
I knew that I wanted to start something probably when I when I started at Pepsi, I feel like I had it in me, but the risk factor that we talked about is obviously a big deal. And then I would say knowing when and what to do was probably the second biggest. So I had known, and I'd known it'd probably be in the better for you space, but I had tested a couple of concepts before Dough.
Oh, I love
So
that.
I had tested a social house, which was right before COVID hit. So that, thank God we didn't do that. I would say the events that we threw were really successful. And it was, I mean, this was like January of 2020. So if I had fundraised for that, that would have been that would have been a nightmare. But there are a couple of other concepts, but knowing CPG so well and having that background, I think it really did. I mean, I have a foundation for it, and really caring about women's health is another thing. Like any brand that I've worked with, target consumer more often than not is female. And so it's kind of funny, and this with what you do is we're so underserved despite being the primary, shoppers, and despite being the decision makers in the household usually. So that's all to say I tested it during COVID. I tested Dough, and I was really okay with parting ways with it. So I invested my own money into it, and I said, if this fails, then it fails, and I'll move on to the next thing. If it does well, then great, let's go raise money. But I think having the objectivity was really important, because you're not so fixated on, holy shit, I need to make this work, and you're just a little bit more objective with your decisions.
I love that. And I think that it's like so stressful in those incubation days that if you have that separation, it makes it a little bit easier. Like even for us, we launched a product, we're in women's health. And me and my co-founder, who's my sister-in-law, we're like, listen, this might not work, but our mission to supporting women is still there and we'll figure it out. So like knowing what you care about, but like you testing different things is so important. So I love that, because I have seen a lot of people kind of stick with their ideas. And I'm like, did you think about pivoting or maybe?
Yeah, there's a time to say, well, that's what I always say. It's funny because we're talking about being candid before, and I'm probably a little too candid, where I will say there are bad ideas. Like there are bad ideas. There are times where you should give up. Whereas like we live in this world where I love the motivation and I love people being encouraging, but there are times where you got to feed your family. Like, there's a time where you got to tap out, and maybe that's not the business. And maybe you have to, so I'm with you about pivoting and kind of reading the room a little bit and understanding, is there a place for this in the market? Because sometimes we push too hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And you might see it, but like, does the market see it? Right. And I love that you were testing it out. You put your, own money just to kind of get it out. But tell me more. How did you, you don't really have a formula background. You weren't like creating products. I don't know if you're a big cook, but how did the idea of the cookie dough come about, and how did you put that first iteration together?
Yeah, I'm not a big cook, actually. My husband is the chef
I
in
love
our
it.
family,
Same.
and I'm like his sous chef. I'll like chop his onions and be helpful. And most of the time I'm not helpful. I'm just like
Yeah.
waiting on my laptop and while he cooks and
Same.
like having wine. Anyways, but that's all to say, it's interesting because I grew up on junk food. I grew up on like the standard American diet, and I think maybe similar to you, but my parents being immigrants, they kind of just trusted the food system in the US. They were like, if the FDA approved it, it's probably fine for you to eat, which is not necessarily true. Now everyone can read nutrition labels and ingredients, and the internet exists. So I've always been like obsessed with brands, I would say, in that way, and like food brands specifically, I thought were really interesting. But I didn't have a formulation background, but I do have a network that is really deep and wide, because I worked before and I
Yeah.
started the company at an older age. Older, I mean, I was 30 when I started it. But I can lean on those people. And even now, I mean, I have a food scientist that's a good friend of ours, and, is an advisor to the business, but I'll call him and be like, hey, we had this weird issue happen in production. Can you help us with this? So when it comes to formulation, food science, all of that, definitely not my background, but I actually don't think as a founder you need that as a background. You just have to have the network of people to kind of support you.
I love that. And I think a lot of people also, like women specifically, I've seen at least, like they want to be the expert. They want to know everything. And it's like you can lean on, and props to you because you're also the sole founder, right? A lot of people are also like, oh, maybe I need a co-founder who in your situation might be the food expert. But I love that you kind of gave your example of tapping into friends and community to kind of help you, because sometimes we forget that's an option starting
Yeah, we
out.
don't ask for help. I mean,
I
that's like,
know.
yeah, talk about therapy. That's the second thing I'm working on, is like you need to be able to ask for help. And you often feel, to your point, women feel like it's like the world is on their shoulders and we should, be able to figure it out. And if we ask for help, maybe we'll look weak or whatever it is. But yeah, that's been something that I've been working on as well. Is like, okay, learning to kind of tap more into, people want to help and people are rooting for you. So learning to tap into that.
I might need to get your therapist number too, because I'm looking for that as well.
It's
I'm
great.
like,
It's
even with
wonderful.
my team, like it's like what, like even utilizing my team and getting their support, right? Like it's so hard for me. I'm working on that, but I've noticed asking for help or pulling people in when it's like crisis. Sometimes I'm like, let me figure everything
You
out
want to figure
myself.
it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm so used to doing that. But like when you're bigger, it's a lot more pressure. So you need a team, you need support, and people are there, like you said, to help you. So I needed to hear that as well. I love that. So, okay, you started, I believe, working with a friend, creating this product. Tell me more about how you created that first iteration. Because from my understanding, what you created in your kitchen, translating that over to a commercial kitchen, like getting that formula to go from like kitchen to commercial kitchen is kind of different. So
Oh,
tell me
it's
more
totally
about
different.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally different. I mean, it's funny when people like we don't get it as much anymore, but we'll have some people, that'll make like a TikTok that's like, I could just make this at home. And it's like, okay, yeah, you can make it at home, but try to make 100,000 pounds of it. Like it's very different. And so that's where you have to lean on your we have a co-manufacturer, but the person who's in charge of producing your product, the company that's in charge of producing your product, they come in super handy with that. So they know they have people all the time that come to them with recipes and they're like, can you just multiply this times 10,000 and make 10,000 pounds of it? And it's like, it doesn't really work like that. Like there's a lot of science that happens with it. The product acts really differently. Ours got really like a lot drier, the cookie dough. Our donuts too, actually, same thing happened. It needed more moisture because when they baked up, they got super dry. There are things that happen specifically in our category. In beverage, other weird things happen, like things explode, things, like there's chemical reactions. Like I advised a beverage company that, they didn't realize that they actually needed to they thought they were shelf stable, but they actually needed to be in a refrigerator. And they figured that out because I believe like people were opening cans and they were like
Oh
exploding or
no.
something crazy like that was happening. I mean, they're
Yeah.
smaller scale, so
Yeah.
obviously not. They were really nervous about it, and I was like, trust me, this happens. It's better it's happening now than a year from now. So that's all to say. There are a lot of learnings when you scale up, and I don't think the general public might not know that.
Totally, totally. And when you were starting out, did you have a co-packer even in the early days, or were you doing it in a commercial kitchen?
No, I was making the product myself. I had baker's assistants. Did you guys? I can't recall. You guys were also making it
We're
yourself?
still actually to this day, we're still in a commercial
Oh,
kitchen.
really? Oh
Yeah.
my
I mean, we've
gosh,
gone
that's
in really
amazing.
efficient. It works. And we
Yeah.
have a team now. But yeah, it's pretty shocking. People are like, really? Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, well, if you can scale it, I mean, like I have friends who have food businesses that actually ended up just going from commercial kitchen to self manufacturing.
Oh,
So,
I
like,
see themselves.
if you're first, if you have a unique product, but two, if you have gotten that efficient, I've seen like it's like okay, well, it maybe makes sense for us to just continue to do this because the margins are so much better. But for us, no, I was making the product. I would make the product until like 2 a.m. and then I would wake up at like 6 and like pack boxes. My husband would help, and this was like a factory in my kitchen that I'm in right now. And then I would drive to UPS in my SUV and just do these drop
Drop
offs.
off.
So
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't do it again because I've done it before. But if you are starting out with a food brand, I would actually recommend it because you learn a lot about your product. So like you either make mistakes or you'll make a bigger batch and you'll realize something weird happens, or it'll sit out on the counter and you're like, oh, it changed color, like that, it's not supposed to do that, like, or whatever it is, you realize things about the product and the texture and the viscosity and all of that stuff. It's like helpful to know what happens to the product.
Totally. And even like fulfilling. I remember when we had a 3PL, I was doing it similar to you. Like I'd go to UPS. I actually became best friends with our like post office lady and I would tip her like once a month. I'm like, can
Oh,
you just
that's so
take, because
nice.
it was like so many more boxes. I'm like, can you just please take these boxes up? And I would just like write her a card and give her money. But I remember when we had our fulfillment center, like getting that set up, she's like, wow, you ask a lot of questions. I'm like, yeah, because I was fulfilling everything.
I
So to
was
your
doing
point,
it.
it's
Yeah.
good to know all these steps, even if you do graduate to a co-packer or a fulfillment center. I love that. I actually, now I just remembered, I remember seeing, I don't know how, I wonder if this was when you had a co-packer in the early days, but I think you like had ruined a batch by accident. And then
We've
like you were on
ruined a
TikTok.
couple batches.
Yeah, I think I saw your reel or it was on TikTok. Yeah, this must have been like a few years ago. And I'm like, I love that they're doing that. Yeah, you were just like walking through everything. I'm like, I understand.
Yeah, it's like it's so crazy because you don't realize how much waste there is. And I mean, there are times that there's just like a quality issue with, 10,000 units and you're like, what the hell? All you see is dollar signs. And like nothing really prepares you for that. And there are times where, one of I think the one you're talking about, we actually ended up selling it because it wasn't a bad
Yes, that's
batch.
right.
It was just a different
The
texture and it
color. Okay,
actually
yeah.
ended up doing really well. So like that in that scenario, we were able to use it as a marketing story. But a lot of times, yeah, you're just like sitting there. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe I have this much product that I can't use or, whatever it is.
Yeah, and you just got to scrap it. You're like, this is like, I have to. You can't sell this product.
No,
So
you
you're like,
can't sell
all
it. No,
right.
no.
I remember
Yeah.
once, I think I brought one batch home. This was like in the early days. Like I had all these bags, and my husband's like, are you gonna, like, why do you have this? I'm like, they're all messed up batches. He's like, just throw it away. And I was like, there's just so many bags. Like, I'm like,
No,
I
I
think I need you
know.
to do it. It's very tough in those early days. Now I'm a little bit better, but like the first time that happens, you're like, oh my God.
I know. Well, and people don't realize like these kind of things now it's like I'm equipped to deal with it. But when you first face something like that, it's like the end of the world. Like you're like, I cannot believe, my business is going to go under. Like you just have all these like crazy thoughts and you think it can't get worse, but it does get
Yeah,
worse
no, for sure.
as you get bigger and like you said, more money, more problems. As you grow, it's like obviously such a blessing to be able to grow and have the demand and be able to do this every single day. But it does also you see things and you do things and things happen that you just never thought you would be dealing with.
Yeah, it's true. And if it wasn't for me doing this podcast over the years, I'm like, I mean, you're right. It's going back to like those early days, you think it's the end of the world. And at least like with this podcast, I'm like, okay, everybody deals with problems. And someone was telling me like, I forgot what I was listening to, but it was like, if you have problems, that means you're in business. It's just part of it. And I think that's actually good because, like you said, there's some things that happen that you truly would never think. Like,
No,
it's pretty,
yeah.
I was like, I want to like write a book and like get all your guys' stories and be like, things you can't make up. Like, I've heard
Literally,
crazy
things you can't.
stories.
Well, it would be really comforting, I think, too. Like the How I Built This is of the world. I used to listen to while I was actually making product, because it was very motivating. But it the flip side, and you hear about the problems, but the flip side of it is all of those companies ended up okay. It's almost like, oh, okay, you get a little bit of hope because they had all these problems, these major problems, and then they ended up okay in their successful businesses, which is the whole premise of the show. But then you don't really get the point of view of people who are in it and who are going through the sky falling. So being able to have these types of conversations, it's like, oh, okay, like at any point in time, a live entrepreneur, the sky is falling and everything's on fire, and maybe it ends up being okay, maybe it doesn't, but like I think it brings a little bit of the reality to it of like, you are going to go through that.
Totally. And how do you manage, maybe it's working with a therapist, but how do you manage those days where it feels like the stress is so intense or the sky is falling?
That's been, I would say, when I would say like that burnout in early 23, that was one of the biggest things that I wanted to figure out is like what I didn't have a good pulse on what drains my energy and what, ignites my energy. And I would just work through anything because that's just what I did. And I could literally work through anything. And so that identifying the points that, and I have to be really cognizant of it, of what completely depletes me. Like when I do hit, for example, if I get really bad news one day, whether it's personal or about the business or whatever it is, if I get really bad news, I actually need to stop and take a break. Whereas my natural state is to continue working because it makes me feel better. So to me, I'm like, okay, say I get an investor, a big investor that says no, my natural state is to email 10 other investors. So I feel like I'm fixing the problem. Whereas what I really need to do is take a beat, go for a walk with my dog, or, listen to a podcast and freaking fold clothes, or just like do something that's like physical, that's not associated with the business. And it's really counter to my nature. So what I've been doing now is realizing those moments of drain that are they're major, like they're too big to kind of work through, and then figuring out, okay, what is it that I need to do? Like that night you don't want to go see friends because you're bummed that an investor just said no, but that actually ends up being better for you than working through the night. Because what I would have done is just worked until midnight and try to figure everything out, and it's like, no, actually going to dinner with a friend is better than doing that.
Oh, it's so true. And I learned all of that. So what you're saying, everybody should just rewind and listen. That's like gold that, you don't want to put yourself through it, but I totally understand. And it's so interesting because I wear this Aura ring and they have this stress score now. And I'm still like working on this. Like I'm also unwinding, working hard. Like I could sit and work for 16 hours, but again, 2-3 years in business, that is not healthy. And you need breaks for sustainability, which I'm also thinking about. But in this Aura score, like it will go up, like your HRV will go up. And then I realize that I don't take enough breaks. So it's okay if you're stressed. Like everybody can get stressed, but you need that break for it to come down. And what I realize most days where I feel totally okay, I'm just hovering in this like high stress state of like, fight or flight, because I think it's normal. I'm like, oh, no big deal. This
That
is
is
just
your normal state. That used to
yeah,
be my normal state. It still is sometimes, but like we just operate a little bit anxious and a little bit,
totally.
just like I'm
Yeah.
always anxious and a little bit rashy, but like that's not normal.
I know. And I didn't know that. And I was like, okay, maybe I should I started doing acupuncture, like things to get me I work at home. So like get out of the house, or I'm trying to go for a walk. But yeah, breaks is when I'm all about everything you're saying. So I love that. There's so much for us to talk about, but I want to talk about your experience on Shark Tank. Actually, before we go into there, I know they had reached out to you early on and you had like pretty good growth in the early days, like 6-7 months in. How are you guys really creating the awareness around your brand? And then when did Shark Tank kind of come into the picture?
Yeah, I mean, social is our number one driver of organic, and I probably for you guys too, but like that was social and influencer. It was free. And gifting obviously has a little bit of cost associated with it, but an influencer posts and you'll get that ROI almost immediately. So that was, I always credit kind of organic, social, and influencer as being our OG. And even still, like we'll see a spike in sales on direct to consumer, and often it's because an influencer posted or a post went viral or whatever it is. So it sucks now a little bit though, because with the algorithm changes, it's a little bit of a different world even than it was in 2020. It was a little bit more predictable, whereas now it's like you could have a post that does has like 4 likes and then you could all have a post and your next one will have like 2,000 likes. It's like so confusing. But that's how Shark Tank also found us. So they saw us on social media, they reached out to our customer service email, and that's how a lot of people still find us. Like I was actually just on the phone with an investor and she was like, yeah, there's a podcaster that I listened to that posted about you guys or talked about you guys on her podcast. And that was my kind of discovery of the brand. So we're really social in nature, and we kind of like love playing with our audience on Instagram too. So I think that's still, I think, really important to us.
Yeah. And of course, you guys have a good product, great brand. Like, I love your social. So you need all of that to kind of get those sales in the early. Like, your product is great. And, we're in a lot of similar ones in the market. So I've had many women on the podcast who have been on Shark Tank and kind of shared a little bit of the behind the scenes of all the work that goes into it. You had like the most amazing pitch. I know Robert also was like, Sabeena, this was like one of the best pitches he's ever seen. Tell me more, like, how was that experience? I mean, I was so impressed by you about how poised you were and like held yourself together. I feel like I'm so expressive that if I was on Shark Tank, like they would like get cuts of me like with crazy expressions. But how was that experience for you?
Well, it's terrifying. I sometimes look back and I'm like, I can't believe I did that. Like you don't think, even before, if someone had said, would you go on Shark Tank? I would probably say no, because one, I'm a pretty private person, despite having to be a little bit public for for the business. But then two, like what a terrifying experience, like having a bunch of cameras and lights at you, and then you're managing 5 scary people, like it's, that are talking over each other and yelling at you. And it was, I sometimes think I just like blacked out during that time. Like that's kind of how you get through it. I would say you get a lot of prep. So I think a lot of people don't know this, but, and maybe folks have talked about it previously on your podcast, but you don't just go in there, like, and dilly dally. Like you get a ton of prep with producers. You usually reach out to a bunch of other founders that have been on it. You practice a ton. You have to shoot videos of yourself doing your pitch over and over and over and over and over again. So you should know it cold by then. So by the time you walk in and you see all these lights and you see the sharks and you're terrified and you see like all of these cameras on this big stage, you're just going through the motions because you have now said this pitch to yourself 8 million times, and you've said it out loud, and you've done the hand motions, and you've pointed to the thing, and you've picked up the bowl and whatever it is. So it's really, they make you learn it so cold that you almost can't screw up because it's just ingrained in your memory and you're doing the motions. So that's what I would say about the pitch. The question and answer is a little bit of a different story because you don't know what questions you'll get. You can predict based on the episodes that you've watched, but with that, it's really, the harder part is not answering the questions because you own your business, your business. It's actually managing the sharks because they are talking over each other. They're yelling at you. You don't know who to respond to. Like it is a little chaotic. And so that piece, I was not as prepared for, but I think I would say a pretty good job at, but you have to almost like it's like managing a group of like kindergartners. It's like, okay, Robert, I'm going to answer your question and then I'll get to yours, Mark. And like, you just have to be really communicative. So that I think set me free a little bit as I was able to manage the chaos.
Yeah, I know. We had Sarah Murray, who's a founder of Curie, on 2 weeks ago. Recently, she said the same thing. She's like, the Q&A is wild. Like you literally have to like manage them. They're like talking over each other, which could be really abrupt. And you guys are there for a long time. Like even with your pitch, I'm like, they for sure edited. Like there's so much probably that
45. Mine was probably 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And in the view air 6 minutes.
Totally. And I was like, oh, they're all going to give her a deal. And I was like, what did I miss out like in the middle? But what I thought was just so interesting is that obviously, it's interesting that you countered with Robert and he was like, no, I don't want to counter. And I'm thinking to myself, but everybody counters. So
yeah,
I was like, was it at the end of the day for them? They saw
it
like
was the end of the day. I was actually the last pitch.
No way, Sabeena. I totally was like, are they just exhausted?
I was the last. No That's funny that you picked up on that. No one has ever.
I just assumed.
Yeah, no one has ever picked up. There was like 9 before me or something.
Really?
Yeah,
It made, because it didn't make sense. Like I've literally have watched them since I was a kid. I'm like, usually like they're cool about it. They must just be like done for the day.
Yeah, they were just like, shut up. Like,
oh my God.
Go away. No, I don't. And I think it's part of it is also like, you have to remember they're shooting a reality TV show. Part of it is, part of my arc at least was this amazing entrepreneur. She's so great, whatever. Her pitch was good. And then the downfall that happened at the end of it, that's a good episode for them. I mean, they re-air it all the time because it probably had a great, the ratings were probably great because it is interesting. It's like, it made you feel something when that happened. And I'm also a reality TV junkie. I love Bravo. And like, that's part, you need the drama a little bit, So I do, when I look back on it, it's like, yeah, it made for a really good episode and it told a story and it was a good arc. And them saying no at the end because I negotiated, it actually like made the episode better. It wasn't great for like the business or whatever it is, but like it's reality TV.
Sure. And yeah, you don't really like see that, but you're right. They're like doing it for reality TV and your arc was great. But how was that experience for the business? Was it still, looking back, would you still go back on Shark Tank? Like just knowing your experience? Yeah.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think, well, despite being terrified now, I don't know, maybe when I first started, I just like wasn't scared of anything. But I would, because of one, not just the exposure, but two, the PR that came after was really, really strong. And so it's a nice little stamp that you can say to a retailer if they're on the fence, or, like people recognize you that are, investors or influencers because they watched and then they're like, oh, I have a little bit of affiliation with the brand. So it does, from a PR perspective, it worked out really well. And we use we use that often in our pitches. We like to put the badge when we talk to, like Walmart or whatever it is. So yeah, I would absolutely do it again.
I love it. And just to kind of close, I had no idea you guys were in donuts now. I'm like, where have I been? But what's next for you guys? What's getting you excited? It could be personal or with the business.
Yeah, I mean, I know our donuts are our fastest growing product line. So those,
Really?
yeah, so we launched, I know it's kind of crazy because you hear about these brands that will start with a certain product and then they still have that product, but the hero SKU becomes something else. And so I won't call it yet because our cookie dough is still the lion's share of the business, but our donuts are the fastest growing. We launched in Whole Foods nationally, Sprouts nationally. We're launching in Target in just a few weeks. So those are, I would say, like the hot product. And then we're launching birthday cake donuts, which is
Oh,
a new flavor
fun.
next week. So that one birthday cake is just, people love it. Like, love that flavor. It's so nostalgic. I can't stop eating them. They're so good. So yeah, that's our next launch.
I love it. Well, Sabeena, thank you for joining us. I could talk to you forever, but this was so much fun. I'm excited to check out those donuts when they're in the birthday cake ones, but you're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.